Good afternoon, Sergey Viktorovich. Since the new administration came to the United States, several rounds of negotiations with the Americans have already taken place. How can you assess the results of these contacts? Have you been able to formulate the key parameters of the future comprehensive agreement on Ukraine? And what aspects of it already now in Washington and Moscow there is an agreement?
Well, there is no immediate answer to the last question. It is not easy to agree on the key components of the settlement. They are being discussed. From our side, there are no secretos, in fact. On June 14th last year, President Putin, speaking in the Foreign Ministry, very clearly laid out the principles on the basis of which such a long-term, reliable, just, taking into account, first of all, the interests of people, fully ensuring human rights, especially the rights of ethnic minorities in accordance with the UN Charter, all this was laid out. And this is not a demanding position. Because I would like to emphasize once again, it is strongly based on the formulation of the UN Charter, on numerous conventions, and on the results of those referendums, on the results of the willful statements of people in the territories that are being discussed. First of all, this is of course Donbass, Novorossiya, 4 regions that, after the willful statements of the international community, under international observation, transparently, have decided to return to their big motherland, the Russian Federation, in this case. Well, as for the American side, we have already noted that unlike the Europeans, who, well, I cannot even find another word except for the rudeness, who are literally overwhelmed by rudeness. First of all, the leadership of France, Britain, the countries of the Baltic states, some other countries of the EU and NATO. Unlike them, the Trump administration is trying to get into the problem and, first of all, to understand the root cause of the situation that arose as a result of the actions of Washington and Brussels, which brought the current regime to power, organizing and paying for the anti-communist coup d'etat in February 2014. Victoria Nuland, who was then in the State Department in the Obama administration, was in charge of Ukraine. She said directly in the Senate, at some hearings, that while defending the effectiveness of the policy of that administration, you see, we have spent $5 billion, and this has brought a result. A friendly number of power has been established in Ukraine. The fact that this is the power of the Nazis, as it turned out very quickly, because the first instincts of that government in February 2014, when they violated the agreement, which was signed literally the night before, guaranteed by the Germans and the French, which we will have to talk about more than once today. If we consider the ways of treason of the agreement approved by the Security Council, they refused to create a government of the national unity, which was supposed to prepare early elections, and declared to the whole square, to the whole Maidan, congratulations. We have created a government of winners. This is when all these processes have already acquired an irreversible nature, irreversible, meaning that only the military force, in the end, can drive this evil out of power. And the first instinct of those fascists who captured the presidential palace, the administrative building in February 2014, was the announcement that they would cancel the status of the Russian language. So the birthmarks are well known. President Trump has already said more than once that a colossal mistake, including the one that became a trigger, or one of them for what is happening in Ukraine now, was the decision of the Biden administration to finally drag Ukraine into NATO. Before that, there were some promises. And this time, the time when Biden came to power, they began to work on this very closely. This understanding, one of the main reasons, has been publicly acknowledged by President Trump more than once. And when we were at a meeting with State Secretary Rubio, and Yuri Ushakov was also in our delegation, and Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, we were also talking about the second, the main reason, that this Nazi government, in the face of Zelensky and his accomplices, took a course to exterminate all Russians. They physically killed many famous people, including journalists, public figures, who defended the need to preserve Russian culture in a country that was, to a great extent, created by Russians, and which, for centuries, Russians not only helped to build, but also built cities, such as Odessa and many other ports, roads, factories. These people were physically exterminated. And by law, if we take the current state of Ukraine's legislation, all Russians have been exterminated. A series of laws that were adopted, a dozen of them, were adopted long before we decided to start a special military operation. And this understanding is also evident in Trump's administration. In particular, Steve Woodcock publicly said, in one of his interviews, I think, with Tucker Carlson, that these territories were populated by people who held referendums, who spoke out in favor of being a part of the Russian Federation. And this cannot be ignored. NATO, the extermination of human rights. We are not talking about land. We are talking about the rights of the people who live on these lands. This is why these lands are dear to us, and we cannot give them away by expelling people from there. Right now, they are offering to expel the Palestinians from the gas sector. What about those who continue to talk about the 1991 border headed by Zelensky? Do they also want to expel all the people from there? Or do they want to return them to their Nazi rule? This is a situation where they want everyone to forget the language, culture, history, everything that Russia has done for these territories. They need the land so that they can trade more expensively. They have already sold something to Starmer at speculative prices. Now they have nothing left to offer to the Americans. These are traders who have nothing sacred. At least when Zelensky was recently asked, I was in Antalya at a diplomatic forum, and I quoted him. In one of his interviews, he said that hatred for the Russians was driving him. To be more precise, he said, we hate Putin so much, but I hate all of them. Yesterday, he confirmed this again in an interview with another media outlet. Therefore, we do not just feel the understanding of this from the Americans. They say that they understand that something needs to be done for these root causes. I do not even want to suspect that there is not a single normal smart person in Europe, but there are certainly those who understand this too. But they shut their mouths with the rarest exception. To tell the truth, only Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, Fica, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, and some political scientists who are not in power dare to say the truth. But the Americans, under Trump's administration, have shown this ability, and it is beneficial for them to distinguish them from those who do not want to think, but who, as soon as they appear on the screen, I am sorry for the vulgar language, begin to demand that Russia stop military action immediately for a month. And then we will have time to quickly patch up the holes of some pacifists. Zelensky has already explained everything, with burning eyes. He sometimes has hot eyes and sometimes dark. When there was a discussion about pacifists, Macron and Starmer tried hard. He said, we do not need pacifists, we need combat units. Let's quickly protect the weapons of the militants from your countries. We will protect our motherland. I had to explain in detail our vision of what and how Ukraine understands. And if we return to other aspects of the Russian-American dialogue, of course, after a 3-year failure, it is not easy to pull relations out of this pit. Moreover, the sincere desire, and we see that it is sincere, of President Trump and his team to return to normality after a certain rush that engulfed the elites in Washington, including not only the Democrats but also some Republicans. After a certain rush, it is now beginning to cause resistance. They are preparing some moves through lobbyists, through the media. We read about it, but in fact it is not hidden. No secret is made of it. They want to prevent President Trump from establishing relations with Russia in an adult way, as it should be between the two great powers, and as it should be between any two powers. The UN Charter, I do not get tired of quoting it, states that the United Nations are based on the sovereign equality of states. Never has any of the Western colonizers, when the UN was not yet established, approached relations with others as equal to themselves. And even when the UN Charter was created after 1945, tell me at least one conflict situation where the West would accept for equal sides of the conflict in which the West actively intervened. Never. Therefore, it is not easy to restore normalcy, although I also gave this example. China has no less contradictions with America. They may not be played so hard in the media space, but in fact, they are two main rivals, or maybe the only two rivals in the world economy and world finance. Look at the current fight for tariffs, not for life, but for death. This is the economy, if you take it. They have huge problems, huge contradictions on geopolitical issues, including issues of territorial integrity of the People's Republic of China, Taiwan, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, territorial disputes, and in these disputes, the United States is definitely on the side of those who are against the Chinese rights presented in this or that situation. In Taiwan, this is a kind of hypocrisy, I believe, when in the words of all the administrations of the United States and all the governments of Europe, they say, yes, we respect and are attached to the position of one China. But, I add, do not dare to change the status quo. And what is the status quo? This is a de facto independent Taiwan, which is armed with completely independent economic and military agreements, without asking China about anything. Therefore, there is also such a game here. And when representatives of the People's Republic of China, here not so long ago, once again said that they strongly support the political and diplomatic regulation of the issue of the restoration of the unity of China, but if the West continues its provocations, if it will incite Taiwan to abandon the peaceful reunification, then China does not exclude any methods. What kind of noise has risen in the West? But I just gave examples that show that the relations there are very seriously burdened with deep contradictions, principled contradictions. But the dialogue has never been interrupted, neither by the Biden administration nor by the pre-Biden administration, with all these public loud adjectives which are exchanged from time to time. It never even occurred to anyone that the Americans could turn away and say, no, we are declaring a boycott. China must be isolated. No one has ever imagined this in their life. But with Russia, Biden has imagined himself a teacher, a mentor to those who make judicial decisions, announce them, make everyone else follow this path. So, the restoration of normal dialogue with Trump is an absolutely natural thing. The fact that it has become a sensation for many is a legacy of Biden's mentality, which wanted to make the complete isolation of Russia normal. This is nonsense. Of course, it was not realized. Therefore, the dialogue is tight, but it is being restored. The main thing is that there is a desire on both sides, despite the problems, despite the inconsistencies of national interests on a number of issues, perhaps even on the majority of issues of the international agenda, to meet as educated, polite people, to listen to each other. This is what is happening. There is an understanding of how to move towards the restoration of the normal work of our embassies in the United States and the US, in Russia, how to solve problems with the temporary issuance of visas to diplomats, including our diplomats who work in the UN. This is a slightly different status. The previous Biden administration, before him Obama, and the first Trump administration, to be honest, they abused their position as the headquarters of the UN. Although by all the rules and by the agreement signed by Washington with the UN, they do not have the right to obstruct the reception of citizens of any country that is a member of the United Nations. People have been waiting for this for several years. There are still cases when approved UN secretaries cannot go to work because the Americans do not give them visas. Nevertheless, the financing of the embassies, when they began to create difficulties under Biden, we, of course, reciprocally and mirroredly responded. And now the reasonable people in the administration who finally appeared there after Biden's henchmen left, or they were pushed away from the case, they solve with us elementary, it would seem, questions of the vitality of the diplomatic mission in a country with which you do not have a broken diplomatic relationship. It looks like some kind of nonsense that you have to do this, but nevertheless. And the third direction is the economy, trade. At the very first stage, the Americans talked about this when the first telephone conversation of Trump with Putin took place, when Witkow came, when the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, Kirill Dmitriev, was in the United States. They are interested, but they are businessmen. Material dividends are very important, and Trump does not make this a secret. This is his philosophy, his policy, for which the American people voted. And what they are looking for is a benefit. It is clear. If you take Europe, it is necessary to reduce the costs there for the maintenance of NATO, including, first of all, the maintenance of the American troops and their contribution to the defense of other members of the North Atlantic Alliance. And it is necessary to look at who has a profit, who has a deficit in trade, who has what taxes, what investment projects. Everything happens. Another thing is that it happens chaotically, but it happened. This is the policy of the elected President of the United States, the current President. Therefore, the material issue has always been important to them. This was evident in the first term of Donald Trump. But here, everything will depend on how they plan to implement the resumption of economic interaction. Because this economic interaction is blocked by 95% compared to some record $30 billion 10 years ago. It is blocked by almost completely illegal sanctions. As you know, if you follow the discussions in our society, we do not run after anyone. We do not ask to cancel sanctions. We have a very powerful group in our public opinion, including the leaders of public opinion, who believe that the cancellation of sanctions will be destructive, because those who are characterized as liberal circles, liberal officials, they will immediately try to turn all these achievements in terms of import substitution, in terms of the sovereignization of our economy, its production, in terms of ensuring security in those areas that really depend on the development of the state. Military security, food security, technological security, to ensure all this with their own efforts. And there is a fear that suddenly these cunning Americans will cancel the sanctions and immediately flood us again with their services, technologies, on which we have been burned. The story with civil airplanes is still not normalized. Double registration, spare parts, engines. We will not give you anything. Let the aviation industry die. No one probably wants this out of normal people. Therefore, I will say again, I am absolutely sure that President Putin is right when he repeatedly drew attention to this, that we should no longer be dependent on the critically important areas for the survival of the state. And if, as he recently said at the RSSPP meeting, if one of those who fled after the call of their governments from business in Russia wants to return, then we will see if there is any free niche for this particular company. Because those niches that they created by fleeing from Russia, they do not belong to them. They are already busy. Many of them are our business and businessmen from those countries that continued to work, continued to fulfill their obligations from the point of view of our citizens' occupancy, and from the point of view of fulfilling their plans to supply certain goods to the markets. And the markets have already planned their work based on the fact that these plans exist. Then all this was trampled on. Therefore, I believe that in this dispute between those who say, in no case should the sanctions be lifted and it will be worse, and those who say, well, what are we going to do then, again, fall into autarkia from the world economy, I am still on the side of the first. Moreover, it is very difficult to talk about autarkia. There is no more globalization of the world economy. It was destroyed, and not by Trump, but by Biden, when he introduced sanctions and made sanctions the only tool of his foreign policy. We were not alone. We have a record number of sanctions, but more than half of the countries of the world are under sanctions, various kinds of restrictions. China, Iran, Venezuela are still the largest recipients of this benefit. But more than 100 countries, one way or another, are under unilateral sanctions of the United States. Therefore, the fragmentation of the world economy began long before today, and of course, the acceleration gave it the use of the dollar by Biden as a weapon for punishing the innocent. There were no negotiations with the country, which was considered as a violator of democratic norms. Services in the dollar were stopped, barriers were built up, these barriers were bypassed, bypass routes were tried to be closed, and so on. It is not in vain that, when there was a tendency to create alternative payment platforms, when calculations in national currencies began to gain strength, it is not in vain that Trump said before and after the elections that one of the crimes, worse than the crime of Biden's mistakes, was his use of the dollar as a weapon, thereby undermining the trust in this payment method and setting up a slow-action mine which will definitely collapse one day. The fear that Trump also voiced about the fact that the BRICS would create its own currency. If so, then it would lay the BRICS with absolutely cosmic tariffs, also shows that he understands what role the dollar plays. And in general, the paper part of the world economy, what role it plays in the U.S. position in the world, in ensuring its dominant role. And the fact that after the tariffs someone lost $50 billion only because accounting books or computers, where all this happens only because they reacted to the changes in reality in everyday life, where it was said, "We will take money from you." But this virtual globalization proved its instability, and the fact that the exchanges are pumped up with these futures, some other terms, and then all this collapses, and a tragedy is made of it. This period passes. I must have tired you.
Sergey Viktorovich, you say that the new U.S. administration has a desire to discuss not only bilateral issues, but also peaceful settlement in Ukraine. At a recent UN session on Ukraine, convened in connection with the strike on Kryvyi Rih, the U.S. representative warned that further Russian strikes on Ukrainian territories could lead to a break in peace negotiations. After that, a few days later, there was a strike on Sumy, where again there was the death of the civilian population and children, according to the Ukrainian side. Does this mean that Russia does not take the U.S. warning seriously? What representative said after the UN session? The official representative of the UN.
The representative of the UN?
Yes.
They have a lot of official representatives, including the representative of the NATO. Recently, she said something in Greenland. She was asked to return home and look for another job. I do not want to say that this woman, I do not remember this statement, which you mentioned, deserves the same fate. But the fact that in the position of the West, Europe, and in the Biden era of the United States, direct lying dominated, we know this very well. Several times in the last couple of years, I drew the attention of the UN Secretary General that he, as the main administrative person of the organization, should comply with the requirements of Article 100 of the Constitution and not take anyone's side, but hold a balanced position and not receive instructions from any government. I told him, I have known him for a long time. I know him. We are NATO, and we have been working for decades in different intersecting positions. I told him that at this post he may not receive, but he fulfills the instructions of Western countries in connection with the situation in Ukraine when he affirms at every step. And now again, after the cries that children died in Sumy, dozens of civilians were killed, he made a statement that he firmly supports the cessation of such violations of international humanitarian law, that he firmly supports the settlement of the Ukrainian crisis on the basis of the UN Charter and the respect for the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and on the basis of the profile resolutions of the General Assembly. First of all, international humanitarian law categorically prohibits the placement of military facilities on the territory of civilian facilities, the placement of arms from the first days of the crisis, from the first days of the conflict, and during the actions of the Minsk agreements, during the Rainbow, but collapsed, hopes that they will allow the world to solve the problem, leaving Ukraine, by the way, in its territorial integrity, well, behind the Crimea. They did not want to do this. And the fact of placing artillery, anti-aircraft defense systems in urban neighborhoods, right next to kindergartens, a million of these facts. And how many videos have been posted on the internet when Ukrainian women shout that the military should be removed from shops, from playgrounds, but this practice continues. And we have facts about who was at the facility that was hit in Sumy. There was another meeting of Ukrainian military leaders with their Western colleagues who, either under the guise of mercenaries or, I don't know, under the guise of whom, but NATO servicemen are there. Everyone knows this. They directly lead. The New York Times recently explained how from the very beginning the Americans played a decisive role in the attacks on Russia. And without this role of the Americans, most of the long-range missiles would not have come off their bases. So the second point, which I regularly remind Guterres, when he says that we need to carry out the UN Charter and ensure the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Why should we ensure the territorial integrity of Ukraine when there is a government that does not represent Crimea, Donbass, Novorossiya, and does not represent a number of other territories that are still under the control of the Kiev Nazi regime? There is a charter, the UN Charter, which, much earlier than the territorial integrity, states that we should respect equal rights and the right of the nation to self-determination. It was this UN Charter that became the basis for the process of decolonization of Africa, first of all. Yes, we waited a long time, 15 years after 1945. But then, on the initiative of our country, the process began, as one of our leaders said, and ended, but not completely. 17 territories are still subject to the most severe violations of the UN Charter. These are, first of all, the French, the English, but first of all, they are. And when Macron, when he screams with a foam in his mouth that the Russians must comply with the UN Charter and international law, he never mentions that, contrary to the resolutions of the General Assembly and the will of the residents of a number of African territories, they keep pieces of these territories for themselves. They probably like to go there on vacation. It is beautiful there. The palm trees grow in Paris. You will not find such a picture there. There is dirt, crime. Therefore, we remind our UN friends that if you say that you need to comply with the UN Charter, be kind. As the main administrative person, come to this charter in full compliance with its principles. The principle of self-determination is connected with the principle of territorial integrity. The resolution of the General Assembly in the form of a declaration on the principles of relations between states in 1970 declared that the territorial integrity of all states whose governments do not violate the principle of self-determination should be respected. Due to this, all the population living on this territory is represented. Well, does Zelensky and his clique represent the population of the southeast of Ukraine? Never. And when the General Assembly today says that the Ukrainian crisis must be resolved on the basis of profile resolutions, it means the resolutions that in the last 3 years have been adopted by the Russophobes with the votes of those who were blackmailed by the West, who were threatened by the West, who were forced by the West. And the resolutions that I mentioned about the need for self-respecting states to represent all the people on their territory are a consensus that no one has canceled. We also talked about the abolition of the Russian language, the legislative abolition, and the recent law on the banning of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the sister of the Russian Orthodox Church. Article 1 of the UN Charter obliges everyone to comply with the rights of any person, regardless of race, sex, language, or religion. The language of religion is directly mentioned in the UN Charter, which our Western colleagues do not care about. And as it turns out, the West does not care either, so we will prove the truth on our side.
Коллегам наплевать, и как получается, и Западу, как он представлен в руководстве ООН, тоже наплевать. Поэтому будем доказывать, правда, она на нашей стороне.
Do you think that these 2 points about the right of the nation to self-determination and territorial sovereignty are incompatible? I see your efforts to connect them and explain that Russia is guided by one of these points. But the opposite side will not agree with you anyway, and you will not reach an agreement. I remember that there was a plenary session with the participation of Vladimir Putin, when the president of Kazakhstan warned that if we are guided only by the idea of the right of the nation to self-determination, there will be 650 regional conflicts, which are absolutely incompatible. Should we do something about it?
То в мире вспыхнет тут же, примерно 650 конфликтов региональных, непримиримых абсолютно. То есть что-то же с этим надо делать.
Делать надо.
Everything should be done honestly. I remember the speech of the president of Kazakhstan, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. I do not agree with him. We later explained our position to our friends in Kazakhstan. He has only the right to territorial integrity. If you are a member of the UN, you must respect the Constitution, and you must respect the Constitution in all its entirety. I gave an example of decolonization. It was written in the Declaration on the Principles of Relations Between States that territorial integrity is respected by those states whose governments represent all the people living there. Paris, Lisbon, Madrid, London, or any other colonial state did not represent all the people living in the territory occupied by the colonizers. This does not require proof. Therefore, the process of decolonization was carried out in full accordance with the Constitution. The fact that the Nazi fascists in Kiev do not represent the relatives of those who were burned in Odessa, and whose children were tortured and killed in Donbass, and whose children are now buried in Donetsk, and whose children are the relatives of those who died in Lugansk in June 2014 in the city center as a result of the bombing of the Air Force. It is prohibited by the international humanitarian law to use their armed forces against their own people in internal conflicts. This is forbidden. I can go on and on with the list. Look at how those who have been under Nazi yoke for more than 10 years, I will not name any other names. I am not talking about those who have been robbed, whose houses have been destroyed, whose herds have been hijacked, whose women have been raped. I cannot say that there will be chaos. Do you know why there will be chaos? First of all, in Africa, when the colonizers left, they drew a map on a ruler, dividing the places of residence of ethnic groups into 3 or 4 parts. This is how we see the situation with the Tuaregs, who live on both sides of the Algerian-Mali border. There are a lot of such examples: Tutsi, Hutsi, Tutsi-Tutu, and many others. Yes, they left such a legacy. Yes, the African Union, in its wisdom, decided that now it is necessary to live on these borders, to negotiate in some way, to arrange good neighboring schemes, so that people, relatives, could cross the border, as it was with us.
But all of them will declare the right of the nation to self-determination. What? The African tribes will declare their right to self-determination.
What will begin? What will begin? The endless war. I am telling you, the African Union, in its wisdom, decided not to touch this shameful legacy of the colonizers, knowing full well that in this case there will be more and more bloodshed. And in the vast majority of cases, no one disputes these borders.
So they are focused on another point on the UN Charter on territorial integrity.
Andrei, I understand that you are more familiar with the logic that you are defending. They are focused on the fact that they implemented the right of the nation to self-determination in the conditions that existed at that time. And in their wisdom, they do not want to question these borders. Although the natural course of things, the tribes live there, is coupled with the fact that sometimes there are different clashes. But if we talk about the fact that now the right of the nation to self-determination means a call for chaos, they do not consider the strong world of this, which is all permitting, and about which apparently you say, Kosovo, please, to care about the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia. At the same time, there was no military activity by the time of the unilateral declaration of Kosovo's independence on the territory around this part of Yugoslavia, Serbia. There was no threat to the population of Kosovo, which supposedly had to be saved, and much more. The same resolution, which was signed before Kosovo was independent, the Security Council decided that there should be Serbian policemen, that there should be Serbian border guards on the external borders of Kosovo. They simply did not care about this. They took a course on separation. And when the right to self-determination was implemented in Crimea, and there was no referendum in Kosovo, there was just a representative of the UN who disgraced himself, the former president of Finland, Marco Ahtisaari, who stood up and said, Kosovo is now independent. No referendum, nothing. The Americans told him what to do, and he did it. And in Crimea, after we gave him the opportunity to hold a free referendum, which was held by several hundred observers, not representatives of the Western governments, but representatives of the Western parliaments, parliaments of countries of other continents, the West said, what right to self-determination is there? No, you cannot, you are Slavs. And we have Albanians. This is the essence of Russia. It is very similar. Now, many films from the history of the Great Patriotic War are shown in documentaries. And the way this upper race treated the same Slavs, and I am now looking at the development of events, it has not gone anywhere. It has not disappeared. Listen to the same mercy. And 8-10 years ago, when I was talking to German colleagues on various geopolitical topics, they sent a signal, you know what? There was a point in their statements. We have long been counting on you and all the others. We owe nothing to anyone else. We will behave as we want. And a specific question from the same opera, the blockade of Leningrad. The Jews who survived the blockade received several times payments from the German government. Our numerous questions, this has been going on for 15 years, how to deal with those who, together with the Jews, in terrible conditions, froze their children, carried them on ice, on sledges, well, forgive me, they ate each other. How about them? They survived, just like the Jews. They did not deserve equal treatment. Back then, the current German President Steinmeier, he was then the Minister of Foreign Affairs, said to me, "No, no, no, we have a separate law about the Jews, the Holocaust. And the blockade is just ordinary war participants. They do not get paid once." No, we paid contributions. I say, forgive me, but still, if this is part of the Holocaust, then the Holocaust is spread among all the blockaders. They are part of the Holocaust not because they are simply Jews, but because they were mocked like this. Absolutely not. Well, let's build some kind of hospital in St. Petersburg and create a center for meeting war participants to make peace. We say, okay, this is probably not bad, but this is not the main thing. The main thing is that you do not show a racist attitude towards the blockade. Absolutely not. We have already explained to them that in St. Petersburg, if they want to build something there, please. But the blockaders live all over the world, and not only in Russian cities, they live in many other cities. Absolutely not. And this is now manifested in the statements of Merz and in many other things. This is sad. But the fate of people is, of course, of great importance for us. And to say that it is impossible to violate the territorial integrity of Ukraine means to return the Russian and Russian-speaking people who fled from the Nazi regime to the hands of these monsters. Now, we started with the fact that the Americans understand the primary reasons. One of them is this absolutely Russophobic approach, which is regulated by law. And in parallel, in the context of the fact that the Americans are beginning to delve into these primary reasons, and there are already discussions about territories, Witkow said that there were referendums on 4 countries. This must be recognized. Kellogg, who is also a special representative of Trump, said that there should be a lot of talks about peacekeepers on the part that is behind Dnipro. That is, it is implied that everything must be reconciled before Dnipro, and there will be no territorial integrity there. There will be, or rather, there was already a self-determination of the people. And offers on the right bank of the Dnipro, as he said, to do something like Berlin after the Second World War. There was a lot of noise, there was a lot of shouting. Starmer and Macron have been using this idea of peacekeepers. They are gathering a coalition of volunteers. They have already sworn an oath to this idea, of course, where without them. But most of the EU and NATO countries are very sour about it. But the main question, yes, and they say, well, there will be some kind of line of contact. But for the moment, the main thing is to stop the conflict, political settlement. They postpone it for later anyway. Enter the force of the question of our president. What will you do while this truce, without strong regulation, suddenly appears? Hypothetically, will you arm? Will you help forcefully mobilize these poor Ukrainians who are being dragged out of the toilets, in front of the eyes of mothers, are being stuffed into some cars of the TCC? In addition to this, the main thing is the question, here they say, no, we will not have so many peacekeepers, Zelensky said. We do not need peacekeepers. We need combat units. A frank person. But Macron and Starmer, they play with words. Now they have come up with resilience force, the force of resistance, or the force of resilience. In principle, this is the resistance. That is, in order to maintain the resistance of Ukraine, they will put behind, already now, not behind the fence of the detachment, which the Ukrainian army is used to, but will put civilized military from civilized Western countries. But what will they guard? All the same regime, no one even speaks now. However, the Americans said the election must be held, but Europe will do everything so that the regime does not change, in essence. Maybe now, a second, they will find some new half-Führer who will be less dependent on various substances. But the essence of the regime will remain, I ask at various events. Here I asked in Antalya a few days ago. And you, when you recognize the inevitability of the preservation of Ukraine already in the severed borders, what kind of regime do you see this severed Ukraine? Will you make them cancel the laws prohibiting the Russian language everywhere and everywhere? Is there no such thing anywhere? Israel never prohibited, even in the most cruel times of the occupation of Palestinian territories, never prohibited the Arabic language, and it is still preserved. But they can, instead of pointing at this creature, as it is called in Russian, Ursula von der Leyen and her henchmen declare with pathos that it is necessary to give the last thread, the last gun, the last cartridge. The last cartridge would not interfere with Zelensky, of course, in general. Everything to the end, so that he would only defeat the Russians, because Zelensky with his army protects European values. This does not cause anyone in Europe. This is a rebellion. Therefore, all these peacekeeping schemes that Macron and Starmer, they come from the fact that it is required to save at least a piece of land on which the Nazi regime, frankly, the Russophobic regime sharpened for another preparation for another war against Russia, as it was done with the Minsk agreements. And this is a very big problem for the reputation of all these peacekeeping schemes that Macron and Starmer, they come from the fact that it is required to save at least a piece of land on which the Nazi regime, frankly, the Russophobic regime sharpened for another preparation for another war against Russia, as it was done with the Minsk agreements. And this is a very big problem for the reputation of the West.
Can I ask that all the recent years, and you and Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, in their public speeches, emphasize the unreliability of Western partners in such negotiations? Moreover, they themselves emphasized their unreliability in such negotiations and admitted frankly, what are the current negotiations different from the previous ones? Now, why can you believe them? Do you think this can be explained somehow from the point of view of common sense?
Common sense is only in one thing, and this, by the way, common sense is Donald Trump's slogan. He always says that he is guided by common sense, and he sees common sense only in one thing, that people came who told us we have a lot of problems, a lot of contradictions. But this is idiotism that came from the past administration, that we do not talk to you. I think I have already talked about this normality, human normality, from which we will not push back. On the contrary, it seems to us that this is important. I will tell you when we met in Riyadh together with Ushakov, with Rubio and Volts, since they invited us there, they began to sing, and their song was that, for Trump, common sense is important. Trump's foreign policy is the policy of American national interests. At the same time, Trump admits that other countries, especially large powers, also, of course, have their own national interests, which are not always, but honestly, in most cases, do not coincide with the national interests of the United States. And then the most important, but Russia and the United States. As Russia, as the United States, and any other significant country as responsible international players in those situations, and their majority, when the national interests of each of them do not coincide, must do everything so that it does not coincide, did not degrade in confrontation. And in those cases, let them be less when these interests coincide, must do everything so as not to miss the moment to translate this coincidence into mutually beneficial material, economic, technological transport, and logistics projects. I believe that this is pragmatic and deserves conversation. I don't know what will happen in 4 years. Now they say, let's buy Boeing again, and what in 4 years? Who knows how difficult the situation will be again. We will stand and disassemble them on spare parts. 4 years may even be too long. Already right in Europe, we write that it remains 1.5 years before the interim elections, where the Democratic Party will break into the cake so that there is no majority. But it's all on coffee grounds. And now, when we are offered normal, as Donald Trump says, deals, we perceive it in a good way. We understand perfectly how a mutually beneficial deal looks, which we never rejected, and how the deal looks which can drive us into another trap.
The word deal is also closer to you.
Just to make it clearer, you asked what they offer us and whether we believe them. I answer you what they offer us. But once again, I said it today. Just maybe somehow that dominant in our society, in the political class, among political scientists, the opinion is that in no case we can no longer allow any restoration of relations in the economy in other spheres, again led to that. We will fall into addiction from conditional spare parts in all spheres, from the state of which well-being depends, and in general the state of our state. This is military food security, technological security. We have already discussed this lesson. I am 100% convinced he will not forget, and not in vain. President Putin, speaking already in the midst of a special military operation, I don't remember where it was, but it was such an institutional speech on our relations with the outside world, with the West in particular. And he said that we have learned lessons, and it will never happen again, as it was before February 2022. It means that we, until the last, tried all the same, some compromises to look according to those rules, despite the fact that our proposal to consolidate the agreements that make us the basis of security we undertook. And after the Munich speech in 2008 proposed a specific agreement, NATO and the United States, all this was pushed back. In December 2021, 2 more agreements, and NATO and the United States proposed on ensuring security of Russia, Europe, and Ukraine without NATO expansion. we were ignored. Blinken then told me in January, don't even get into the topic of NATO, it's none of your business. We can think about to agree that the medium-range missiles planned to be deployed on the territory of Ukraine, which were prohibited by the agreement from which the United States left, that they will be limited in number. That's all, here you go. But to the last, these two agreements that we made in December 2021, it's according to the president right after another November 2021 speech in the media, he, to the last, hoped that we will convince them in absolute disaster scenario, which was supposed to pull Ukraine into NATO. We know it was planned to create bases in Crimea before 2014. Then Crimea was already closed, but on the Sea of Azov, the British were going to make naval bases and much more. And what the president said, that it will never be as it was before February 2022, means that he, to the last, hoped for common sense. But now common sense appeared in the White House. We will see.
Tell me, please, what will happen after the dissolution of the CIS in February 2026? What do you think? You probably won't have time to work out anything in return.
There will be an arms race.
Why?
The president said we will never participate in the arms race. There will be some kind of one-sided restraint.
Why we have our own policy, and we know how to ensure the defense capability of our state in case strategic situation in the world will not change, despite the normalization of relations with the Americans. No one stops in the doctrinal documents of the United States and NATO to declare the opponent publicly official and the enemy. It doesn't stop. And the SNV3 agreement, it consists. It's just like, Stefan, you can't pull it out. We want to visit your nuclear facility. This will be the territorial integrity. And there is another written at the very beginning that we were able to conclude because we respect each other, because we are for equal security, and because we recognize the relationship between strategic offensive and defensive systems. This relationship has long been broken by the exit of the United States from the Treaty on Medium and Short-Range Missiles, before they left the Treaty on Anti-Missile Defense. But since then, they began to create anti-missile defense to create medium and short-range missiles, which are placed all over the world and in Europe and in Southeast Asia, along the perimeter of the borders of Russia and China. The Trump administration on this topic said, let's sit down with China. They don't offer us anything. We will not offer anything to anyone because we didn't break the arms control. We didn't break the SNV3 from the basic principles without which it could not have taken place. The Biden administration refused, and the Trump administration has not yet returned to these principles, although there is a dialogue on many issues.
About this.
They know perfectly well we are self-sufficient. We have everything. We know how to provide our defense capability. If they have a feeling that their nuclear arsenals have aged a lot and continue to age against the background of modernized our weapons, probably they are interested in somehow correcting this discrepancy. And the second time we did not receive such offers. The last time Biden asked to check nuclear facilities by which, by the way, Ukrainian drones of American production were launched. And the Trump administration said that we are interested to discuss strategic relations with the United States, Russia, and China. And China says, sorry, I'm not interested. Bilateral offers did not come to us. If they come, we will explain how we see truly equal talks, how to provide strategic stability. But before that, I repeat, we do not ask, let's sit here, let's talk. We did not break the process in any of its components: economic defense, about medium and short-range missiles, and much more. Putin repeatedly said we do not want to ask. If you do not like to talk to us well, we will behave accordingly. We will draw conclusions. If you want to come back, explain what you want to come to us, and we'll see whether it suits us or not. So the Americans offered a dialogue on issues, say, on the issue of the Ukrainian crisis. We talk, we explain our position. In the same way, they offered a dialogue on the normalization of the work of the embassies. We are for.
And when will the embassy work in Moscow? When will it be in a full-fledged regime? When will it be possible in Moscow to get an American visa again?
When will the circulation of merchants increase?
Well, after this interview, just can I say that after this interview, the embassy will work.
What do you want a 5-year visa in 3 years? I would like it is not harmful to want. I know this proverb. The fact is that any process cannot be tied to some date. Now they say there should be peace on Easter. Why? Because the president of Finland, so it seems it will be right. And he played golf in Mar-a-Lago, that's all he said. And then he said yes. We will have to then, our neighbor there are more than 1,000 kilometers will have to be restored. And 3 days before, just with such, I don't even want to use words, he was so well, the face of the mature by and large demanded Russia to clean up. And in general, we will not forget that Russia took thousands of kilometers of square territory. So that's what it turns out. Mr. Stubob is worried. And not that they lived with us, they got independence from us. They were explained why we need to move the border from Leningrad. They all this, as it turns out, they forgot. They forgot how all the time their leaders were in the sauna with their Soviet and Russian colleagues. How someone even played hockey. But once they said that Russia violated everything in the world by introducing troops as part of a special military operation. And that's it, immediately give us our territory. Therefore, when such people like Macron, who insulted us with the last words, and suddenly said, well, someday I will probably be the main negotiator from Europe. Or Stubb, who shouted that they were offended taking away their territory and that Russia is an aggressor. Well, someday we will normalize. If these people think that they will behave like this, and that then they will suddenly want or understand that they can't stand to normalize relations, then we will think whether it's time or not, and under what conditions these relations will be normalized. I'm afraid, but nothing is forgotten in all senses.
If you allow me, the last question, from all the previous words, it follows that in Moscow, they believe in the compatibility of the American country and in the role of Americans as mediators in the Ukrainian conflict. There are already 2 agreements which are concluded with the mediation of the Americans about safe shipping in the Black Sea, and accordingly, the agreement on the moratorium on the cessation of strikes on power plants. And, as we see, neither the first nor the second does not fully act. How can you comment on this?
There are no such agreements on March 18th. During a telephone conversation, President Trump told President Putin, "I would suggest that for 30 days he said, I understand why the ceasefire. Now it is not clear how to organize." Remember, at the press conference with Alexander Lukashenko, Putin laid out our reaction to the idea of a 30-day general truce, how it will look, and whether it will be used to pump up new weapons for violent mobilization. Thousands, tens of thousands. I don't know how much they would scratch, how to achieve that violators immediately identified, knowing how Ukraine likes to lie. So Trump offered 30 days moratorium on strikes on nuclear power plants on power plants. Putin immediately agreed during the conversation, gave an order to introduce such a ban for 30 days. It turned out that 7 drones were already flying to attack Ukrainian power plants. We knocked them down. And the second, Trump said, let people get together on the Black Sea Initiative, resume its actions. People met. People agreed on 5 points, which Americans spread. And we spread additions to these 5 points, in particular, to the paragraph, which stated that the Americans will contribute to the resumption of the normal implementation of the Russian grain export and fertilization, in terms of insurance rates, in terms of ports, in terms of insurance freight ports, refueling of ships. In general, some practical things, exactly the things that Mr. Guterres 3 years ago, when the first Black Sea deal was signed, from 2 parts, half a bag of Ukrainian grain, half a bag of grain and fertilization of the Russian Federation, to remove the obstacle on the way of which our agricultural production, fertilization of grain, he did not do it. Therefore, knowing that for 3 years nothing we sell, we have opportunities, we just use other routes. But still there is little grain and fertilization on the market, which are very much needed by poor countries, so that they somehow improve their food production and receive humanitarian aid from us. Therefore, to be honest, it's great that the United States now, just like Guterres 3 years ago, called to help the easing of Russian export by removing obstacles. The Americans also formulated the same readiness. But knowing what the hopes of Guterres broke, we honestly said, if you express readiness to help, this is what needs to be done, so that the situation does not happen again, when with such fanfare welcomed this deal, and then it turned around from the point of view of Russian export. Well, here is a check in principle purity of our Ukrainian neighbors. This is what we insist when discussing with the West any schemes that they promote wanting to help with regulation. 2 of the most shouting examples, I talked about how they burned on May 2nd, 2014 in the House of Trade Unions almost 50 people. Ukraine said then, Poroshenko, that we will investigate. No one investigates. And the Council of Europe, a year after the tragedy, when we were still members called to help with the investigation, made some modest decision. We are ready to provide services to the Ukrainian government in the investigation of a terrible tragedy. Slowly, as they say our people forgot about it. And no one remembers how, although there are video materials with those who set fire, who shot people jumping out of the windows a lot, no one is interested. But for me, the brightest example, this is Bucha, in which 2 days after, as a gesture of goodwill, at the end of March 22, from which our parts were withdrawn under the conclusion of the Istanbul agreements, which in the end the Ukrainians banned Boris Johnson. 2 days there was no one except the local authorities. The mayor ran there in front of the BBC cameras, said that we restored control over our motherland. And 2 days later, suddenly, as a sensation, the same BBC shows not somewhere in the basements, but on the central wide street, dozens of corpses neatly laid out along the side of the road. And immediately it is stated that this is the atrocity of Russia that they have avenged. The Ukrainian people are introduced by the European Union, by American Biden, by Ukrainian sanctions workers. 3-4 days Russia is a beast. Since then, I personally trying to get the names of those people whose corpses were shown with such a pump on BBC, and then on all other channels. I am twice being in New York at the General Assembly, meetings of the Security Council, Guterres sitting right in front of this round table, asked in person, "Can I help?" because no one denies we were accused. Okay, there is an investigation, just tell the names. We no longer hope just to see how engaged you are, so to speak. He turned away. Then I was one-on-one with Sergey, but this is not my competence. I say, wait, but you have a Human Rights Council in which they created, in violation of procedures, a whole independent mission on human rights in Ukraine. For us it is not legitimate, but it exists. And we wrote an official paper. Can we understand what is there after the Bucha? It's been 3 years at least, the names tell. Nothing is answered to us. This is already official paper. I am in New York. I do not avoid the case when I give a press conference there. Everyone who is accredited, BBC, CNN, all. I say you are a journalist. You have such a genre as a journalistic investigation. But the General Secretary leaves from the answer. The Human Rights Council leaves from the answer. Can you journalists write a request to this UN specific? No one does anything. So for me, the situation is clear. And how dangerous the self-determination of peoples I also understand. Not how much it is not dangerous when fascists capture the land, never to anyone except the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union not owned. And they do their absolutely disgusting things. Still trying to us some announcements to do, including suddenly recalls some Budapest memorandum. There is no Budapest memorandum. Nothing about what you have to bow your head before the anti-constitutional coup welcomed by the authorities' racists, real Russophobes. But when they talk about the borders 1991, the borders of 1991 arose due to the divorce Belovezhsky and then Almaty between the republic's former Soviet Union, based on those conditions that existed then. And one of the key conditions for us, for the races of the USSR at that time, was a declaration of independence of Ukraine, which was adopted a year before, and in which it was clearly stated that they forever will be a neutral state, that they will not enter any military blocs. And then it migrated to the Constitution. And it was right in the Constitution, it was written that they, the state of Ukraine, guarantees the observance of the rights of the Russians separately and all other national minorities. Despite all these wolf laws which I talked about in the Constitution, this position has been preserved. It was only later that they began to insert the introduction into NATO. But we recognize the independence of Ukraine as a neutral, friendly, non-bloc state in which the rights of the Russian and other national minorities.
Сказано, что они навеки будут нейтральным государством.